appears that centuries of persecution have made these three-eyed men partly amphibious, that is, capable of filling their lungs with air and remaining underwater almost as long as a turtle."
"That's impossible," said Kemper bluntly.
"I thought so myself," she said with a smile, "until Tigertail told me a little more about them. He says that they can breathe through the pores of their skins, that their bodies are covered with a thick silky hair, and that when they dive they carry down with them enough air to form a sort of skin over them, so that underwater their bodies appear to be silver-plated."
"Good Lord," faltered Kemper, "that is a little too much."
"Yet," said I, "that is exactly what air-breathing water beetles do. The globules of air, clinging to the body hairs, appear to silver-plate them, and they can remain below indefinitely, breathing through spiracles. Doubtless the skin pores of these men have taken on the character of spiracles."
"You know," he said in a curious flat voice, which sounded like the tones of a partly stupefied man, "this whole business is so grotesque, apparently so wildly absurd, that it's having a sort of nightmare effect on me." And dropping his voice to a whisper close to my ear,
"Good heavens," he said, "can you reconcile such a creature as we are starting out to hunt with anything living known to science?"
"No," I replied in guarded tones. "And there are moments, Kemper, since I have come into possession of Miss Gray's story, when I find myself seriously doubting my own sanity."
"I'm doubting mine now," he whispered. "Only that girl is so fresh and wholesome and human and sane."
"She is a very clever girl," I said.
"And really beautiful." "She is intelligent," I remarked.
There was a chill in my tone, which doubtless discouraged Kemper, for he ventured nothing further concerning her superficially personal attractions. After all, if any questions of priority were to arise, the pretty waitress was my discovery, and in the scientific world it is an inflexible rule that he who first discovers any particular specimen of any species whatever is first entitled to describe and comment upon that specimen without interference or unsolicited advice from anybody. Maybe there was in my eye something that expressed as much, for when Kemper caught my cold gaze fixed upon him he winced and looked away, like a reproved setter dog who knew better. Who also, for the moment, put an end to the rather gay and frivolous line of small talk which he had again begun with the pretty waitress. I was exceedingly surprised at Professor William Henry Kemper, D.F. As we approached the campfire, the loathsome odor of frying mullet saluted my nostrils. Kemper, glancing at Grew, said aside to me, "That's an odd-looking fellow. What is he, Minorcan?" "Oh, just a beachcomber. I don't know what he is.
He strikes me as dirty, though he can't be so physically.
I don't like him, and I don't know why.
And I wish we'd engaged someone else to guide us." Toward dawn, something awoke me, and I sat up in my blanket under the moon. But my leg had not been pulled. Kemper snored at my side. In her little dog tent, the pretty waitress probably was fast asleep. I knew it because the string she had tied to one of her ornamental ankles still lay across the ground, convenient to my hand. In any emergency, I had only to pull it to awaken her. A similar string, tied to my ankle, ran parallel to hers and disappeared under the flap of her tent. This was for her to pull if she liked. She had never yet pulled it, nor I the other. Nevertheless, I truly felt that these humble strings were, in a subtler sense, ties that bound us together. No wonder Kemper's behavior had slightly irritated me. I looked at the silver moon. I glanced at Kemper's unlovely bulk, swathed in a blanket. I contemplated the dog tent with, perhaps, that slight trace of sentiment which a semi-tropical moon is likely to inspire even in a jellyfish. and suddenly I remembered Gru and looked for him. He was accustomed to sleep in his boat, but I did not see him in either of the boats. Here and there were a few lumpy shadows in the moonlight, but none of them was Gru lying prone on the ground. Where the devil had he gone? Cautiously, I untied my ankle string, rose in my pajamas, stepped into my slippers, and walked out through the moonlight. There was nothing to hide Gru, no rocks or vegetation except the solitary palm on the backbone of the reef. I walked as far as the tree and looked up into the arching fronds. Nobody was up there. I could see the moonlit sky through the fronds. Nor was Gru lying asleep anywhere on the other side of the coral ridge. And suddenly I became aware of all my latent distrust and dislike for the man, and the vigor of my sentiments surprised me, because I really had not understood how deep and thorough my dislike had been. Also, his utter disappearance struck me as uncanny. Both boats were there, and there were many leagues of sea to the nearest coast. Troubled and puzzled, I turned and walked back to the dead embers of the fire. Kemper had merely changed the timbre of his snore to a whistling aria, which at any other time would have enraged me. Now, somehow, it almost comforted me. Seated on the shore, I looked out to the sea, racking my brains for an explanation of Gru's disappearance. And while I sat there racking them, far out on the water, a little flock of ducks suddenly scattered and rose with frightened quackings and furiously beating wings. For a moment I thought I saw a round, dark object on the waves where the flock had been. And while I sat there watching, up, out of the sea, along the reef to my right, crawled a naked, dripping figure, holding a dead duck in his mouth. Fascinated, I watched it, recognizing Gru with his tarry black hair all plastered over his face. Whether he caught sight of me or not, I don't know, but he suddenly dropped the dead duck from his mouth, turned, and dived under water. It was a grim and horrid species of sport or pastime, this amphibious business of his, catching wild birds and dragging them about as though he were an animal. Evidently he was ashamed of himself, for he had dropped the duck. I watched it floating by on the waves, its head under water. Suddenly something jerked it under, a fish perhaps, for it did not come up and float again as far as I could see. When I went back to camp, Gru lay apparently asleep on the north side of the fire. I glanced at him in disgust and crawled into my tent. The next day Evelyn Gray awoke with a headache and kept her tent. I had all I could do to prevent Kemper from prescribing for her. I did that myself, sitting beside her and testing her pulse for hours at a time, while Kemper took one of Gru's grains and went off into the mangroves and speared grunt and eels for a chowder which he said he knew how to concoct. Toward afternoon the pretty waitness felt much better, and I warned Kemper and Gru that we should sail for Black Bayou after dinner. Dinner was a mess as usual, consisting of fried mullet and rice, and a sort of chowder in which the only ingredients I recognized were sections of crayfish. After we had finished and had withdrawn from the fire, Gru scraped every remaining shred of food into a kettle and went for it. To see him feed made me sick, so I rejoined Miss Gray and Kemper, who had found a green coconut and were alternately deriving nourishment from the milk inside it. Somehow or other, there seemed to me a certain levity about that performance, and it made me uncomfortable. But I managed to smile a rather sickly smile when they offered me a draught, and I took a pull at the milk. I don't exactly know why, because I don't like it. But the moon was up over the sea now, and the dusk was languorously balmy, and I didn't care to leave those two drinking milk out of the same coconut under a tropic moon. Not that my interest in Evelyn Gray was other than scientific, but after all, it was I who had discovered her. We sailed as soon as Gru, gobbling and snuffling, had cleaned up the last crumb of food.